This episode of Conjuncture was recorded in London in May 2024 and produced with support from the Trinity Social Justice Institute and the Antipode Foundation.
Welcome to Conjuncture. My name is Jordan Camp. I'm really pleased to be here with Catherine Hall. She's Professor Emerita of Modern Social and Cultural History at University College London. In 2021, she received the Leverhulme Medal and Prize from the British Academy, which named her one of the most methodologically innovative researchers in the field of social and cultural history worldwide. She was the principal investigator for the legacy of the British Slave Ownership Project. She is the editor of both the Critical Perspective on Empire series at Cambridge University Press and the Stuart Hall Selected Writing series at Duke University Press. She's the author of a number of foundational works, including, most recently, Lucky Valley, Edward Long and the History of Racial Capitalism, just out from Cambridge University Press. So I'm really pleased to be with Catherine at her home here in London to speak about Lucky Valley, racial capitalism, social reproduction, and the history of slavery in the present. So thanks so much, Catherine, for taking the time to speak with me. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's very good to have you here, Jordan, and I'm honoured that Conjuncture, that your series has chosen to talk about Lucky Valley. Makes me very happy.
The honour is ours, Catherine, I assure you. So, well, first, congratulations on Lucky Valley. It is a remarkable achievement. Historian Vincent Brown describes it, and I'm quoting him, a magnificent counter-history of racial capitalism and a call to redress the enduring injustice of Edward Long's world. So I wanted to ask if we could start by you explaining the title. What is Lucky Valley? Who was Edward Long? And how'd you come to this project?
So Lucky Valley is the plantation in Jamaica, in the parish of Clarendon, that Edward Long and his family before him and his family after him owned throughout from the time of the conquest of Jamaica in 1655 into the 19th century. And so the Long family were a family of slave owners in Jamaica. And like most of these slave owners, they lived between Jamaica and England. And their intention always was to make enough money from slavery and sugar to leave Jamaica and return to England. So Edward Long was on the island for 11 years running the plantation, Lucky Valley, and he always intended to write a history of Jamaica. And when he got back to England in 1769, he started to write it. And it's a 3-volume history which was published in 1774 and has never been out of print since, and is the authoritative text on 18th century Jamaica. It's an extraordinary 3 volumes with the richness of its description of the making of a slave society. And Edward Long was described by Peter Fryer, who wrote one of the first books, Staying Power, on black people in Britain, as the father of English racism. So that's one of the reasons why he's always interested me. And finally, I turned to really doing some sustained work on him, which has resulted in the book.
Yeah, well, thanks for this. I know that, prior to, or maybe alongside working on this project, you had directed the legacies of the British Slave Ownership Project, which I'd mentioned in the introduction, which explores how colonial slavery shaped modern Britain. It features a public-facing website, a comprehensive database. People can trace the names, maps, addresses, and the impacts of British slave ownership in the Caribbean. It also allows the public to analyze the history of colonial slavery and the impact on British life. So can you talk a bit about this project and how did it inform the questions that you approach in Lucky Valley?
Well, the Legacies project came out of a lot of thought about the problem that as critical historians we faced of the way in which the story of abolition has always been told in Britain. And it was told as a story of the wondrous humanitarianism and generosity of the British, who, quotes, freed the slaves. Now, that's a very partial version, to put it mildly, and was challenged many, many years ago by Eric Williams in his classic text, Capitalism and Slavery, which looked at the economic reasons for the abolition of slavery, alongside the whole question of black resistance and humanitarianism, and saw the complexity of what was actually happening. Well, we wanted to find some way of countering this story of abolition, which has been taught, written about and taught over generations in Britain, and had come up very significantly in all the events which took place in 2007 over the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, which turned for many into a kind of festival of the greatness of William Wilberforce, who had led the struggle and did not ask about the 200 years of slavery which preceded abolition. So it was 2007 and all the activities which we were then involved in around that, which really gave us the impetus to know that we had to do a major piece of empirical work which would demonstrate to Britons that slavery was not something that belonged in the US and the Caribbean, that race had been a part of British history and British society for a very long time, ever since the beginnings of colonialism and colonial slavery. So we did this project, which was based on this extraordinary archive of all the slave owners who received compensation at the time of abolition. And they received 20 million in payment, which was, the money was loaned but was produced, of course, was paid by British taxpayers. And we were able to trace all the Britons, do some detailed work on all the Britons who got compensation, which was a way of demonstrating to people how Britain was integrally involved in the slavery business and benefited hugely. So we were able to demonstrate how the money in compensation went into railways, it went into merchant banking, it went into marine insurance. It also went into the development of the new colonies of white settlement in Australia and New Zealand. So that money flowed out. It also built country houses, it bought artworks, it bought wonderful libraries. The artworks are now sitting in the Tate and in the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery. We've been able to track a lot of these concrete legacies, and then the people. And of course, it's enabled the descendants of slave owners, many of whom turn out not to be white, but to be brown, because of the whole history of miscegenation, to find out more about their ancestors. So it has had a huge impact. And by now, worldwide, we've had many more than 3 million hits on our website. So it really demonstrated something that is undeniable, whereas the major problem about the history of race and slavery in Britain is that it's denied. You know, it's not us, it was you lot in the US, it was those people in the Caribbean, not us, which of course is the story they tell in France too. So actually being able to say to people, no, it was here, it was this person, it's this house that was built on it, it's this city that had a whole new area of urban development. So anyway, the other thing that we were, wanted to be able to demonstrate was the part that these slave owners played in bringing forms of racial thinking into Britain, into the metropolis, and that not only was it at the time of slavery, but that in the period after emancipation, slave owners and their descendants were very significant in reconfiguring racism for a post-emancipation period. So they've been ideologues of racial thought for a very long time. Now, Edward Long is in Jamaica in the 1860s, so he's living through the high point of the creation of wealth through plantation slavery. And I always knew that his history, which is used by every scholar of the Caribbean because it gives such a detailed picture of 18th century society. So it's used by geographers, anthropologists, sociologists, historians, critical race theorists. You know, he's very, very well known, but he's well known mainly for his thinking about race. And there's a lot more to his thinking about race than critical race theorists have understood. So I wanted to know more about what had he actually effected in these 3 volumes.
Yeah, and you go into quite significant detail about that. And one of the things that you argue is that Long's writings in the 18th century represented the emergence of a new conjuncture. And so I wanted to ask you if you could explain that argument. Why was it important for you to use this concept of conjuncture?
When Long was in Jamaica, when he went to Jamaica to make his fortune, which he did in the late 1750s, and in the period he was there, the slave owners were doing extremely well and were creating an enormous amount of wealth, which of course was because of the work of the enslaved. It wasn't what they were doing. So he was confident and comfortable in the view that was very well established in England, that colonial slavery was a necessary fact. It was contributing greatly to Britain's wealth and power. And at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, it was clear that Britain was on the verge of becoming the global power, which of course it did throughout by the early 19th century. So he was confident about all of that, comfortable with, slavery being a necessary, unfortunate but necessary fact of life. And then he arrived back in England in 1769, and he found a new situation. He was facing a new situation because for the first time there were really critical voices being raised much more publicly, much more powerfully about slavery being a problem. And the reason for that was in part to do with the British success in the 7 Years' War, which meant that Britain ended up ruling over, or attempting to rule over, large parts of the world with, quote, native peoples of many different varieties, different ethnicities, different religions, which really provoked the question of, how are we to do this? How are we to manage it? And furthermore, there were very important disturbances which they had to face, like the Carib War in St. Vincent, where this is a period when the press is growing very rapidly, when communications are improving between the Caribbean and Britain, and the news was coming back from St. Vincent, for example, of the cruelty and the terror associated with that war, and producing a lot of criticism. So these were new kinds of criticism about the doings of empire, which added on to the things that were already troubling people a lot about what was going in India, about the plunder in India, about the long-term question of the morality of British rule in India, which had been raised in a very serious matter in the 1780s. So all of these questions are becoming much more significant. And then the legal question was also put on the table because Granville Sharp, who was one of the first generation of very, very important abolitionists, wrote a book in 1769 which challenged both the morality and the legality of slavery. So to his astonishment, Edward Long found that this was a new time. You know, slavery was in question in a new way. And then there was a drama which brought this absolutely to the surface, which was the trial associated with James Somerset. Now, James Somerset had been enslaved in the Caribbean and was brought by his owner to London. And like many enslaved people in London, he managed to escape. Because London, you know, big city, there were many what some people now call freedom seekers or runaways. And so Somerset had escaped, but there were also plenty of people being paid to kidnap escaped enslaved people and in the attempt to re-enslave them. So James Somerset was kidnapped, and his owner hoped to get him back to the Caribbean. But Granville Sharp, who already had experienced some of these legal issues, knew that the time had come for a test case. And so the case of Somerset became a major public event in London in 1772. And it was presided over by Lord Mansfield, who was the Lord Chief Justice. And the issue was whether an escaped enslaved person could be captured and held illegally, held without any proper legal process. And the abolitionists and the slave owners gathered to hear this case. They knew that it was a matter of debate whether it was legal or not, and it was declared that it was not legal, and Somerset was freed. Now, the abolitionists understood this as meaning it's not legal to hold enslaved people in England. That's not what the judgment said. The judgment was literally about James Somerset. But from the point of view of the slave owners, they were now terrified because they couldn't rely on the law to hold what they regarded as their private property. So Edward Long now faced this situation that, you know, the slave owners had always been confident that they could rely on the law. The law was on their side. You know, the law said it was legal to sell enslaved people. The enslaved people were things, they were shows, they were commodities, they weren't persons. So writing his history, he now had to think hard about what the legitimation for slavery was if it wasn't going to be the law. If they couldn't rely on the law, what could they rely on? So he turned to the body and the difference between the black body and the white body. And so it's one of the first texts to elaborate the notion of essential, natural difference. And that's what makes it so significant in the, as it were, the genealogy of race theory.
Yeah, well, you know, you say in the book that this racial thinking, you know, cast a long shadow on the present. One of the goals of the book is to provide a history of the present of racial capitalism, a concept that, as you note, has gained new purchase in the wake of the crisis of '08, but has much deeper roots, as it were. So I wonder if you could help our audience, viewers and listeners, understand this concept of racial capitalism and talk a bit about how you use the term.
Well, it's very interesting because when I started on working on Edward Long, I wasn't thinking about racial capitalism. I was thinking about his racism and how he articulates his racism. But as I worked on the 3 volumes and understood increasingly what he was doing, I came to realize that what he was doing was describing and analyzing for us how the articulation between racist ideologies and capitalist forms of organization actually worked in Jamaica and across Jamaica to across the Atlantic to Britain and West Africa in the mid-18th century. So thinking about that relationship between race and capitalism, which I'd always thought about in terms of a question of articulation between one set of forms and another. They're not the same, they're different. But then I realized that the term racial capitalism was really a useful one for thinking about that articulation, which people have been thinking about for a very, very long time. The term, insofar as I've followed the history of the development of the term, was really, I date it back to the debates around anti-apartheid and particularly the Marxists in South Africa, who were trying to think about, is it possible to get rid of apartheid without getting rid of capitalism? And that's where, and we were all very involved in those struggles over anti-apartheid in that period. And of course, quite a number of the South African exiles were in London. There were debates going on with people like Harold Walpy, who was a good friend of ours. So I know Stuart was reading all that material in the 70s. I wasn't, but now I found, this is really an interesting range of thinking to go back to. And of course, racial capitalism became a kind of, it suddenly became a fashionable term in the context of the whole revival of critical thinking about race and capitalism, and the recognition that capitalism really was integrally but differentially connected to particular forms of racism. So it's, again, I just say it's the articulation between the one thing and the other. And what's so extraordinary about Edward Long is that over the 3 volumes, he explains to me, he describes to the readers, if you're thinking about it in a particular way, how that works, how it works in relation to the plantation economy, in relation to the whole mercantile system, in relation to the state organization of mercantilism, how it works in relation to the organization of space and place. I mean, one of the reasons why the book's called Lucky Valley is because these places are so important and mean so much, both to the people who lived and died there, but also to us as we now try and understand the legacies over such a long period. So Lucky Valley came to stand for me it stands for plantation slavery. For a particularly brutal, particularly violent form of exploitation.
Yeah, well, thanks for this. And, there's so much more to say about this, about the racialization of place, about the kind of geographical insights in the book. But one of the things that really was fantastic for me is that in this history of racial capitalism scholarship, much work focuses on the cotton production. Mm-hmm. But as you note in the book, sugar had been, more central, an epicenter even of the trade long before cotton. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this insight and why it matters.
Well, of course, anybody who works on the 18th century knows that sugar was at the heart of the production of wealth, whether it was for the Dutch Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire. Sugar was the new gold. And King Sugar produced extraordinary levels of wealth, which, as Sid Mintz told us, many decades ago and explained so wonderfully in his book Sweetness and Power, it was also one of the reasons why it became such a successful commodity, was because it was a way of sweetening the lives of the new white proletariat in Britain particularly, but also in Western Europe. So it wasn't, because glucose can give you energy, it was extremely important to the diet of the new proletariat. So that whereas in the 17th century it was still mainly a luxury commodity, it became something much, much more than that. And indeed, the sweet cup of tea became an absolute staple of working class life. So sugar transformed the Caribbean. It transformed life for millions of people in West Africa who were seized in order to produce it, and it transformed the lives of people in Western Europe as well. So long before cotton, sugar had created these trade routes, it created this wealth, it created a new capitalist class, and of course both C.L.R. James and Eric Williams, in their classic works, were well aware of this long before people started writing about racial capitalism and cotton. And although neither James nor Williams ever use the term of racial capitalism, of course what they're talking about, they don't use the term articulation either, but they're talking about the relation between race and capitalism.
Certainly. Yeah, well, it turns out perhaps the history of racial capitalism in North America should go back to reading some James and Williams in addition to Lucky Valley. You extend important insights that you've developed over the years in Lucky Valley, not the least of which is this wonderful article from the History Workshop Journal, Gendering Property, Racing Capital. And you trace the connections between the gendered organization of property relations, that's your term, and the accumulation process, the capital accumulation. So what do we learn differently about the history and reproduction of racial capitalism when we attend to the gendering of property in a patriarchal order, as you put it?
Well, what we learn is about the reproduction of the capitalist class rather than the reproduction of the enslaved or the proletariat. So there's been wonderful feminist historiography on the reproduction of the enslaved and how important that was to capital accumulation, because the infants of enslaved women were owned by the slaveholder, so they represented new labour, and they were left in people's wills. When you left an enslaved woman, you were also leaving, as they write in their wills, their increase, which means the babies to come. So the pattern for the capitalist class is very different from the pattern for the enslaved. So the children of the colonists are immensely precious, and white women are, as they're described by one of the historians, Cecily Jones, in a very good phrase. She calls them, white women are the reproducers of freedom. They're how freedom can live on into the next generation. But that means also that the land and the people have to be, all that has to be protected in forms of property ownership, marital organisation and inheritance. It all has to be organised in the interests of a long-term future. And so, for example, the use of marriage settlements is very important. The ways of providing for dependent women who are never expected to be economically active in this class. The practice of primogeniture, which means that the plantations are not divided but go to the oldest son. All of these are ways of defending and accumulating capital.
Yeah, well, this is an extraordinary, insight from the book. One of the most generative contributions, I think, and I think will alter the way we think about racial capitalism moving forward. So thanks for this work. One follow-up question I had about this is, you attend to very specific forms of evidence in making this argument. I mean, the paper trail that you have here is enormous. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the archive that you're tapping in making the argument.
Well, our database, the LBS database, has been very important for that, and the marvelous work done by my colleagues, and particularly Nick Draper. But, for example, wills are absolutely crucial. Wills often give a lot of evidence about how property is to be left. So 18th century wills aren't exactly they're not the easiest forms of evidence to use. So the hours of labour that have gone into that, much of which is now on our database so that, it's there for public access. And of course, I should say that our database has been enormously increased by all the contributions we've had from the public, the people who've done work and have given us new evidence, which we've then, of course, checked and been able to make use of. So well over 1,000 contributors are part of our public resource, which of course was also all paid for by public funds, all of which we're very delighted about, because not all these archives and databases are freely accessible, but ours is. So the use of wills and marriage settlements and family histories, these are all ways into this archive. But of course, we've always known about the reproduction of the capitalist class, the landowners and the industrialists. And indeed, my first big history project that I did with Leonora Davidoff, which came out as Family Fortunes, is about the organisation of the family and marriage and property in the English middle class. So it was taking those insights to the colonial context it was like, hadn't thought about this before. There's something really, really important here.
Yeah, fabulous. As you make plain from the prologue right through the epilogue, Lucky Valley grows out of a half-century long dialogue with your late husband, Stuart Hall, who you had married in 1964, if my memory serves me. He passed in 2014. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to reflect on that dialogue and how it shaped the work you're doing in the book.
Well, I'd say, of course, Stuart always knew about Edward Long, but he did know. I'd started the work before he died, but he certainly didn't know I was going to spend the next 9 years working on it. I think he'd have been a bit horrified that Edward Long should take so much of my time. But on the other hand, Edward Long spent a long time writing his 3 volumes. He was worth deconstructing over a long period. But one of the things which I found so striking was that, of course, Stuart's story is a diasporic story. Stuart came to England as a student, as a Rhodes Scholar when he was 18, and stayed. He never intended to originally, but he stayed, and he's part of that first generation of migrants who changed the face of Britain with their children and their grandchildren and so on. And that was such a fundamental turning point in terms of Britain's having to come to terms in a new way with questions of race. Why are they here? Well, we are here because you were there, as was so memorably said. So now Edward Long's story is the reverse story. Edward Long goes from England to Jamaica and comes back to England. But again, it's a diasporic story. And so I found this, of course it's completely different, but it's also connected because it's about that long history of connection. And that's what I've been interested in for such a long time. I suppose ever since, you know, my first visit to Jamaica with Stuart in 1965, which was such a transformative moment for me in some ways, but that transformation in me took a long time, because it wasn't for quite some time after that that I actually started to work on Jamaica. And that was one of those eureka moments, because one summer we were on holiday in Jamaica with our children, with our rather fed up adolescent children who were being sort of dragged around to visit relatives and all of that kind of thing. Anyway, we were driving along the north coast, and we came, which is the, you know, beautiful, beautiful beaches and so on, and wonderful hills. And we came to a very small village called Kettering. And I thought, this is very odd. Why is this village called Kettering? I was born in Kettering in Northamptonshire. And then we got into the village, and the biggest building in the village was a Baptist church. And I thought, this is even more odd. You know, my father was the Baptist minister in Kettering in the 1940s when I was born. So I thought, what is this connection? And then I saw a plaque which was about a missionary called William Knibb. And I thought, I think there's something to be found out here. And that was the beginning of the first big piece of work I did. And the book's called Civilizing Subjects, which is about, I mean, it was my discovery of the long history of connection and of both abolitionists and planters who were engaged in debates about race, you know, all through the 19th century. So that history of connection came home to me in such a vivid way. I mean, not literally about blood, but about historic connections through abolitionists and missionaries. And of course, you know, I was unsympathetic in some ways to what those missionaries were up to, but some of them were like William Knibb. I mean, for a long time, he was a major figure in Jamaica because he fought for emancipation. So this was a whole discovery about the underside of Englishness, the unconscious of Englishness, which is race. And that's what, in many different ways, I've explored ever since. And of course, my relationship with Stuart and my marriage with Stuart was absolutely, completely all part of all of that.
Yeah, well, it comes through beautifully in the book, right from the reflections on his time at Oxford till the epilogue, when you describe a kind of dialogue with Policing the Crisis and the whole articulation of race and class. You know, one of the things, as I mentioned to you before, that really stands out for me about this book is that it's a conjunctural history of racial capitalism, you know, a synthesis of history and theory. What's at stake in that approach for you?
Well, you know, I finished the book with a discussion of the portrait of a black Jamaican, Francis Williams. And Francis Williams was the son of a man who had been enslaved but who was freed and who became quite a significant property owner, a black slave owner, of course, of whom there were many, free black slave owners. And Francis Williams came to England in the 1740s, in the 1720s, to be educated, to have an English education. And, you know, there's some possible evidence that he might actually have gone to Cambridge. He was discussed as a possible member of the Royal Society because of his skill in mathematics and astronomy. And he went back to Jamaica in the 1730s. And there is a portrait of him, which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And in the history, in Long's History of Jamaica, he has a whole chapter which is an attempted demolition of Francis Williams, because Francis Williams was a poet and he wrote Latin poetry. He was a learned man who aspired to be a gentleman, and the portrait is of an 18th century gentleman, but he's black. So Long, we are almost certain, was actually looking at this portrait when he wrote this horrible chapter on everything that was wrong with Francis Williams, because the portrait was much later, in the 1920s, sold by the Long family, and the Victoria and Albert Museum bought it. So anyway, that portrait was hanging in a very sort of dark corner of the V&A. So when I went to look at it, I thought, you know, this is very funny. This is a really interesting painting. And then Black Lives Matter happened, new conjuncture. And I thought, surely we can do something about this portrait and claim, you know, a counter-narrative to Edward Long. And indeed, that was the beginning of a whole process of the recovery of the portrait, of it getting a great deal more attention. And next month we have a symposium at the V&A all about it, gathering of the scholars who've been working on it and who give us a different picture of how it was possible to be a black man and to challenge the ways in which Long was writing and talking about race in the 18th century.
Thanks. I wish I could be here to see it. Well, Catherine, I could talk to you all day, but I want to respect your time and just ask if there's anything that I haven't asked that you would like to add.
I think I've said plenty. What can I say? Please read the book.
Well, Catherine, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me for Conjuncture. It's been a real pleasure. So thank you very much. And I also want to thank all our viewers and listeners for joining us for this episode. Stay tuned.